I ironed the lavender dress the night before, smoothing out every crease with the kind of care you give something sacred. It was my late husband Henry's favorite color on me. He used to say it reminded him of the lilacs in our first garden, the ones we planted the year Michael was born. That memory clung to me like perfume, soft and sentimental. I wanted to feel close to him, even though he wouldn't be at our son's wedding. In my own quiet way, I suppose I wanted him to see me. See us. On this day that was supposed to be about love, about new beginnings. I tied the silver ribbon around the gift box myself. A small crystal keepsake for the couple, etched with their initials, nestled beside an old family heirloom bracelet I had once imagined giving to my future daughter-in-law. It had belonged to Henry's mother. I took a long breath before placing it in the box, pausing for just a moment to feel everything at once. Nostalgia, hope, pride, and the tiniest pinch of sadness. Then I locked the door behind me. The venue was elegant, in that modern way people find elegant now. Sleek white chairs, floating candles in tall glass vases, and music that hummed through hidden speakers. I arrived 10 minutes early, holding the silver box carefully, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor. I smiled at the woman managing the guest list, gave her my full name and waited for that small moment of recognition. Her eyes flicked across her clipboard. Then she frowned. "I don't see a Margaret Hensley on here. Are you sure you're part of the groom's side?" Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was the sort of voice used for misplaced delivery drivers or confused strangers. I nodded once, tightly. "I'm his mother." Her expression didn't change. She just stepped aside and said, "Feel free to find a seat anywhere. It's open seating toward the back." Open seating. My heart tapped once hard. I looked around, searching for a familiar face. The bridesmaids in blush were taking selfies. A few of Michael's college friends lounged near the bar, laughing. No one looked my way. When I spotted him, my son, he was across the room, tall and composed in his navy tuxedo. His new wife, Clarissa, stood beside him like she belonged in a bridal magazine. I expected him to turn, to smile, to say something. But he didn't. His eyes swept past me like I was part of the wallpaper. For a split second I thought maybe he hadn't seen me. So I waved, small and discreet. Nothing. A waiter offered me a glass of champagne. I took it with trembling fingers and slowly made my way toward the back. The only open table was near the kitchen doors, where servers hustled back and forth carrying trays of garlic-slicked shrimp and stuffed mushrooms. I set my gift on the table and sat alone, adjusting the hem of my dress that now felt oddly formal in the dim, indifferent light. Every few minutes I reminded myself that maybe there had been a mistake. That Michael would notice. That someone would realize something had gone terribly wrong. But the ceremony began and no one came. I watched my only child say vows without a single glance toward the woman who raised him. It wasn't until the reception that someone finally spoke to me, a second cousin I hadn't seen in years. She hesitated as she passed my table, tilted her head and said, "Did they forget to reserve you a spot up front?" Her voice was half sympathy, half confusion. I forced a smile and said, "It's all right." But it wasn't. The DJ called out names for the family dance. Clarissa danced with her father. Michael danced with Clarissa's mother. I watched my son hold another woman like she was family. And I sat there with my glass of warm champagne and a silent scream blooming in my chest. I thought of Henry then. Of the way he would have walked me to my seat, made sure I was honored, seen. I remembered the last conversation we had about Michael before he passed. How proud he was, how much he hoped Michael would never forget where he came from. And I realized, sitting at that forgotten table next to the kitchen, that somewhere along the way, my son had. There were things they didn't know, things no one had asked about. Accounts quietly accumulating interest. Property in Vermont. Bonds Henry had set aside in my name. Over $10 million quietly sleeping under my protection. I looked at that silver-wrapped box and felt the tiniest shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. But a reckoning maybe. A decision still unspoken. I stayed until the cake was cut. I clapped at the toasts. I smiled when I was supposed to. But in the quiet of my car, hands trembling over the steering wheel, I knew this was the beginning of something. Something they would never see coming. When Michael was little, he had this habit of holding onto the hem of my shirt when he was nervous. He wouldn't say anything, just that quiet tug of fabric like a tether grounding him to something safe. I remember his chubby fingers gripping my sweater the first day of preschool, the first time he got stitches, the time he forgot his lines in the school play and stared at me until I mouthed them back to him from the third row. He was my shadow for years. My partner in pancake breakfasts, in bedtime stories, in Sunday morning gardening. When Henry was alive, the three of us were the kind of unit that moved together without thinking, each of us instinctively protecting the other's soft spots. Henry had a laugh like warm honey, and Michael inherited that. He also got Henry's quiet way of listening, the kind of presence that made people feel like they mattered. For a while, I let myself believe I'd raised a man who wouldn't lose that. But something began to shift after Henry passed. At first it was subtle. Fewer calls. Shorter visits. A kind of distracted politeness in his voice, like he was speaking to me while his mind was already somewhere else. I tried to tell myself it was grief, that maybe he was learning to carry his own pain like I was. That maybe we were just walking parallel roads for a while. Then Clarissa came into the picture. And the distance turned into something harder. She came from a world Michael hadn't grown up in. Designer handbags, vineyard brunches, gallery openings. Her parents ran in the kind of circles that never noticed people like me unless they were pouring their wine. I remember our first dinner together. She complimented my necklace and then asked if I had ever summered in Provence. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. I could see how he softened around her, how he studied the way she moved through rooms like she owned them. He began talking differently, cleaner vowels, clipped sentences. He stopped leaving his muddy boots by the back door when he visited. Eventually he stopped visiting altogether. The dinners stopped. The birthday cards turned into texts. Holidays became excuses. First hers, then his. And slowly, without either of us saying it out loud, I stopped being part of his real life. I became the woman he called when he needed insurance paperwork or a family recipe. I became background. I once asked him if Clarissa's family ever wanted to meet me properly. He said, "It's not really their thing. They're more professional." And then he changed the subject. Just like that. Back at the wedding, the music swelled and strangers toasted my son like he was the best man alive. One of Clarissa's uncles gave a speech that started with, "When I met Michael, I knew he was the kind of man who would protect this family with everything he had." I sat there quietly, picking at the edge of my napkin, wondering what that version of Michael would say to the little boy who once cried because I forgot to leave the hallway light on. I sipped my champagne and watched Clarissa's father clap my son on the back, beaming like he'd raised him himself. The photographers kept circling the main tables, capturing every polished smile, every curated hug. No one pointed a lens toward my corner of the room. I might as well have been invisible. But it wasn't just the photos. It was the body language. The quick, nervous glance Clarissa gave me when we crossed paths by the dessert table. The way Michael's best friend, Darren, greeted me with a tight nod and then turned away before I could even reply. Even the server who cleared my half-eaten plate did it with that same glance. Like I wasn't supposed to be there, like someone had forgotten to tell me. I didn't need anyone to say it out loud. I could feel it. I wasn't part of this version of Michael's life. Not the polished, curated, status-conscious life he'd worked so hard to build with Clarissa. I didn't fit the aesthetic. And yet, through it all, I kept trying to spot him, the boy I raised. I searched his face when he laughed, when he danced, when he stood with her under the fairy lights and pretended like nothing had ever come before this. I looked for the tug on the hem of my shirt, metaphorical as it might be. But there was nothing. Just a man in a tuxedo charming the people who mattered now. Sometimes silence is louder than any insult. And in that silence you start to rewatch your whole life like a film no one else is seeing. You remember the sleep-deprived nights, the scraped knees you kissed, the report cards you hung on the fridge. You remember the birthdays you planned, the emergencies you handled, the love you gave without asking anything in return. You remember everything. And they remember nothing. But I did. I remembered it all. And I carried every bit of it with me that day like armor. Because somewhere beneath the lavender dress, beneath the ache in my chest, beneath the strange chill in that wedding hall, I was still his mother. They could make me invisible. But they couldn't make me forget. I waited until the reception had quieted after the speeches and the first dances, when the music softened and people were too full of cake and wine to notice much of anything. I saw my moment. Michael was standing near the balcony, his jacket unbuttoned, drink in hand, laughing at something one of Clarissa's cousins had said. I made my way toward him slowly, steadying myself with each step. He saw me approaching and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition maybe, or obligation. He gave a tight smile and stepped away from the group. "Hey, Mom." Not "Hi, Mom," not the familiar warmth of our old shorthand. Just a quick mechanical greeting like he was trying to remember how to say it. I returned the smile, but mine came a little slower. "Could we talk? Just a minute." He nodded, led me toward a quieter corner where the string lights cast a soft golden hue over the grass. From a distance, we must have looked like any mother and son having a heartfelt chat. But up close, it felt like standing next to a stranger wearing my child's face. He looked down at his drink, then back up at me. "I know today's probably felt different," he began, carefully choosing each word like it might explode. "It's just that things are complicated now." I tilted my head. "Complicated?" He nodded. "Clarissa's family, they have certain expectations. About how things should be done. About traditions, appearances. They're not bad people, Mom. They just have their ways." I didn't say anything. I just waited. He glanced toward the party, then back at me as if worried someone might see us. "I know it might have felt awkward with the seating, and I didn't mean for you to feel left out. But I said quietly, not accusing, just stating the weather." He didn't answer that. "I'm not asking to be the center of your life, Michael," I continued, my voice low. "But I raised you to be kind. I raised you to notice when people are hurting." His jaw tensed for just a moment. Then he said, "I hope you can understand that we're building something here. The future. And that sometimes means reshaping things." Reshaping. The word fell like a stone into my stomach. Reshaping meant trimming away the parts that didn't fit. It meant people like me, quiet, unfashionable, too ordinary to be useful, got gently pushed out of the frame. Before I could speak again, Clarissa appeared at his side like smoke. Her hand slipped easily around his arm, her smile poised and pleasant. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise, "didn't realize you two were having a moment." Michael shifted uncomfortably. Clarissa looked at me, that practiced brightness never quite reaching her eyes. "You know how these nights are," she said with a soft laugh. "Family everywhere trying to make space for the real connections." The real connections. She said it like she wasn't aware of how sharp it sounded. Or maybe she was. Maybe that was the point. I nodded once, more to myself than to her. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out the small white envelope. The gift. The thing everyone expects from a parent on a wedding day. I handed it to Michael, letting my fingers linger for just a second too long as he took it. "Congratulations," I said. He looked at the envelope briefly like he hadn't expected it. "Thank you," he replied. Clarissa glanced down at it too, subtly curious. I almost smiled. They would open it later, I imagined, maybe in the privacy of their hotel suite or their new condo, expecting a check, perhaps a heartfelt note, maybe even something extravagant, because that's what people like them had grown to assume. That parents exist to give, to offer, to step aside gracefully while the next generation takes center stage. But the envelope was empty. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted revenge. But because some things are meant to be felt, not explained. That blank envelope was the space they had created around me. The silence they handed me in place of respect. The absence of acknowledgement wrapped neatly inside white paper. Michael slipped it into his pocket without another word. Clarissa gave a gentle tug on his arm, guiding him back toward the crowd. And just like that, I was standing alone again, surrounded by the scent of rose petals and champagne and 1,000 tiny conversations that had nothing to do with me. But in that moment I didn't feel small. I felt awake. They thought I had come to give something. They didn't know I had already decided to keep everything that mattered most. The house greeted me with silence, the kind that presses itself into your bones. I slipped off my shoes in the hallway, listening to the familiar creak of the floorboard by the coat rack, the one Daniel always said he'd fix but never did. I stood there for a long while, just staring into the dim hallway, still clutching the empty purse that had held the even emptier envelope. Outside, the sky was beginning to bruise, the last traces of evening light fading beneath the tree line. I walked to the back room, our old sitting room, and opened the window just slightly, enough to let in the scent of pine and cooling earth. It had always been my favorite place to think. Daniel used to call it our pause button. We'd sit there for hours after dinner, just breathing the same air and sharing silence without expectation. I pulled the cedar box down from the shelf. The wood had darkened over the years, but the clasp still worked like new. Inside lay the papers. The will. His will. The words I had read so many times I could nearly recite them aloud. He had written it himself. Stubborn as ever, he refused to let a lawyer mangle his meaning with cold words. I could still hear his voice in the pages, clear, calm, deeply rooted in thought. He had always known how to use silence like punctuation. To my beloved Julia, I leave the whole of our estate. Every dollar. Every stone. Every story. I trust her to see not with eyes alone but with heart. She will know what must be passed on and to whom and when. I had asked him once gently why he hadn't split it with Michael. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Because money only grows in hands that know where roots belong. You'll understand, love, when the time comes." At the time I thought he was simply being poetic. He was prone to that, especially near the end when his body was failing faster than his mind. But now, seated in this quiet room with the scent of him still faint on the blanket draped over the chair, I realized he hadn't been poetic. He had been preparing me. $10 million. It was an odd kind of power to carry quietly. A burden that didn't weigh down the body, only the soul. I had never touched a cent of it beyond what I needed. Not because I was frugal, but because Daniel's last words about it weren't instructions. They were a trust. A covenant of sorts. I looked over to the small photo on the side table. Michael as a boy, maybe 6, holding a jar of fireflies in the garden, his smile wide and crooked. I used to think that smile could forgive anything. Now it only haunted me. At the wedding, his eyes had been glass. As if I were just another guest he had to be polite to before moving on to someone who mattered. I had raised that boy. Fed him through heartbreak. Held him the night he shattered his wrist falling from the tree in our backyard. I had whispered him through fevers, cheered him through graduations, stayed up stitching his prom pants the night before he decided khakis weren't cool. And now I was something to be managed. Smiled at. Steered away from the good seats. I turned back to the will. To whom and when. Daniel had left space between the lines. Not in ink but in meaning. He was asking me not just to give, but to discern. So I opened a drawer and pulled out a notepad. Not the fancy stationery I used for birthdays. Just a plain yellow pad, the kind he liked for grocery lists and garden plans. I began to write. Not a legal document, not even a letter of inheritance. Just a note. A statement of truth. Michael, this isn't a letter of anger. It isn't punishment. But I need you to know that I see things now. Not as a mother desperate to be loved, but as a woman who has finally stepped outside the story she was forced into. I don't owe you anything. Not because you failed me, but because what I carry isn't yours by blood. It's mine by experience, by memory, by understanding what legacy really means. I will not be passing down a fortune to see it turned into silence. Legacy should echo, not disappear. I paused. The words had come easily, which surprised me. I'd expected my hands to tremble. I thought maybe I'd cry. But there was only stillness. Like when the storm has already passed and you finally notice how loud the birds sound in the quiet. I folded the letter and placed it in the same envelope that once held Daniel's final words to me. I didn't know if I'd ever send it. Maybe it wasn't meant to be read. Maybe it was just meant to be written. I looked out the window again. The sky had slipped into night. A few stars blinked stubbornly behind wisps of cloud. Somewhere in the distance an owl called once, then vanished into the dark. And for the first time in a long time I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to arrive. I had arrived. Right here. In this quiet. In this choice. In this secret that would remain not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Not all gifts are meant to be given. Some are meant to remind you that you have the right to choose who sees your worth. And who never looked for it at all. It was a Wednesday. One of those quiet afternoons where the hours stretch like fabric, soft and slow. I was in the kitchen rinsing out a teacup. The window cracked open to let in the smell of the hydrangeas that had just started to bloom. The knock at the door startled me, not because it was loud but because I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there she stood. Emily. Her smile was already pressed into place, too perfect to be sincere. She held a little box in her hand, some kind of pastry, and her tone sang out with sugar. Hi, Julia. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by. I hope it's not a bad time. There are moments when you instinctively know that something isn't right. That this isn't a visit, it's a performance. But I stepped aside and nodded. Of course not. Come in. She walked in like the house was a museum, grazing her fingers along the edge of a photo frame, pausing to examine the floral arrangement on the table. She commented on the scent of the air, the charming rustic vibe of my living room. I smiled faintly and offered her a seat near the window, the same chair Daniel used to sit in when he wanted to think. I went to put the kettle on, quietly placing 2 teacups on the tray, along with the honey jar she used during her one visit years ago, before the wedding invitations were even discussed. Chamomile all right? I asked. Oh, that's perfect, she chirped. You always have such a calming space. She paused, looking around, then leaned forward slightly, her voice dipping into what I suppose was meant to sound intimate. Michael and I have been so busy with everything post-wedding. He wanted to come today, but work is just, you know. I nodded again. No agreement. Just acknowledgement. As I poured the tea, she continued. We've been thinking more about the future. With finances and investments and all that boring stuff. She laughed, but her eyes didn't. That's smart, I said simply, handing her the cup. She took a small sip, eyes drifting across the room, settling on the papers I'd left absent-mindedly on the corner table. A single page had slipped free from the folder. A legal document stamped with my attorney's letterhead, the words estate and revocable trust clearly visible. Her gaze fixed there too long. And something subtle shifted in her posture. Her shoulders straightened, her voice softened but turned intentional. You know, Michael's always had such a good head for managing money. He helps my parents with theirs now, actually. I think it gives him a real sense of responsibility. I stirred my tea slowly, letting the silence linger. It was a powerful thing, silence. When you stop rushing to fill it, people start revealing more than they mean to. She tried again. Anyway, I thought, if there's anything you ever need support with, paperwork, accounts, planning, he'd be more than happy to help. Family should help family, right? I met her gaze, steady and quiet. Of course, I said, my tone unreadable. She leaned back slightly, the smile beginning to falter. She glanced again at the papers but didn't ask directly. Instead she pivoted. You know, Michael mentioned how proud he is of how well you've maintained everything on your own. That takes real strength. Not everyone could do that at your age. Ah, there it was, the subtle condescension wrapped in praise. I folded the papers calmly and tucked them back into the folder without comment. She adjusted in her seat. We all worry sometimes about how much there is to keep track of. Difference. Property. Taxes. That kind of thing can get overwhelming. I smiled and poured her another cup. But I find when you've lived a life full of people assuming you need their guidance, you get very good at sorting things out for yourself. Her lips parted for a second, unsure whether it was a compliment or a boundary. She chose not to respond. We sat like that for a while, sipping quietly, the tension growing thick like molasses between us. She tried once more lightly. Is everything okay with the house? Or the paperwork I saw, are you working on something new? I placed my cup down gently. Nothing I can't handle. There was no malice in my tone. Just finality. She didn't push again. He knew. Or at least she suspected. And I saw it settle behind her eyes. The realization that there might be something more in this house than faded wallpaper and old photographs. Something of value. Something she didn't have access to. When she finally stood to leave, she offered a hug. I accepted it politely without warmth. Thanks for the tea, she said. Let's not wait so long next time. I closed the door behind her and listened to the silence return. Only this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the things left unsaid. Of the power I hadn't surrendered. For the first time in a very long time I didn't feel small in my own home. And I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. There's something about stillness, real intentional stillness, that reveals the shape of your life. Not just the parts you show to others, but the quiet corners where truth sits untouched. After Emily's visit, I found myself walking through the house not in sadness but in clarity. Every photograph on the wall, every drawer I opened held echoes of the life Daniel and I built. One layered not with luxury but with meaning. We'd made promises to each other. Some spoken, some simply understood. And I realized then that the greatest promise was not to pass down money, it was to pass down character. I sat at the kitchen table, Daniel's old fountain pen in hand, and reread the will one last time. His signature, bold and elegant, still looked fresh. I could almost hear his voice. Only give it to someone who protects what we stood for. Back then I hadn't fully grasped the weight of those words. But now I did. It wasn't about controlling the future. It was about protecting the soul of our past. I thought about the wedding again, not with the raw ache of rejection, but with the sober eyes of a woman who had learned what silence reveals. My son hadn't just failed to see me. He'd failed to see the values that built him. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of distance and performance, I still believed there was a sliver of him that remembered who we were. Who he was. But belief, I knew now, wasn't enough. Love needed to be tested. Gratitude needed to be spoken. That was when the idea came. I met with my attorney the following week. She was a thoughtful woman, always patient with my pauses. I asked her to help me establish a charitable trust in Daniel's name. A foundation dedicated to helping older women, especially those cast aside or made invisible by the very families they raised. Women who had loved without conditions, only to be met with silence, distance, or convenience. The foundation would offer legal support, housing assistance, and emotional counseling. A quiet shield for women whose stories never made the headlines. It felt right. Not just logical, right? As though Daniel had been waiting for me to arrive here in my own time. My inheritance, our story, wouldn't end with bitterness. It would become shelter. And then I turned to the matter of the remaining estate. $10 million is a heavy sum when left to someone who doesn't yet understand its weight. But I wasn't spiteful. I wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want to teach my son a lesson. I wanted to give him a mirror. So I revised my will. Michael would be eligible to receive a portion of the estate, yes, but not unconditionally. He would need to write me a handwritten letter. Not typed, not emailed. Pen to paper. And in that letter he must name one moment, one memory, one fragment of our shared life for which he was truly, deeply grateful. Not performatively. Not because he thought it would open the vault. But because he had taken the time to remember where he came from. And if that day never came, if the letter was never written, then the full sum would go to the foundation. It was not a punishment. It was a preservation. The real gift was never going to be the money. It was the invitation to remember. To humble oneself. To reconnect not with me as a benefactor but as a mother. As the woman who raised him. Who held his fears in the dark. Who taught him how to read by tracing each letter on the kitchen floor with chalk. Who stood behind him while he learned to ride a bike, heart racing each time he wobbled. I wanted him to reach for that memory. And if he did, the wealth would follow, not as a prize but as a reflection of restored legacy. My lawyer raised an eyebrow when she read the clause. What if he doesn't understand the symbolism? She asked gently. I smiled. Then he's not ready to carry what we built. It wasn't an act of coldness. It was one of clarity. Of drawing a boundary not to hurt, but to protect the very thing Daniel had asked of me. To ensure that our life's work, our love, our values weren't traded for convenience or status. In the evenings, I found myself lighting a candle for Daniel and reading through old letters we'd exchanged in our early years. There was one where he wrote, "We may never have riches, Julia, but what we give each other is the kind of wealth that lives long after we're gone." And now, strangely enough, we did have riches. But he was right. The true wealth had always been the way we showed up for each other. That was what I was trying to pass on. A template for love that isn't loud but lasting. As I sealed the envelope with the updated will, I placed it in the wooden drawer beneath our wedding photo. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like alignment. Somewhere out there, Michael might someday sit alone with pen and paper and remember who I was. Not just the mother at the edge of a wedding, but the woman who whispered stories into his dreams, who saved all his crayon drawings in a box, who never once stopped loving him. And maybe, just maybe, that memory would be the key. The wedding had long slipped into evening by the time Michael returned to the hotel suite. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and camera shutters had faded into a hush. He looked tired. Maybe from the ceremony, maybe from the weight of navigating something he didn't fully understand yet. Emily was already in the bathroom, humming softly as she removed her makeup. Michael loosened his tie and sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled the silver envelope from his inside pocket and studied it for a moment. It looked ordinary, tasteful, deliberate, a mother's touch. He hesitated before opening it. Perhaps he expected a generous check. Perhaps he expected nothing at all. But as he pulled out the folded card and opened it, his eyes scanned the simple line written in careful cursive. Sometimes love means walking away until they come back for you. That was it. No signature. No check. No lecture. Just the soft echo of absence. He stared at it for a long time. He didn't speak. Didn't show it to Emily. He simply folded it back, placed it on the nightstand, and sat in silence as though something in him had been rearranged, quietly without fanfare. Now here I am. Months later. The seasons have shifted, the trees along Maple Lane dusted with the first yellowing hints of fall. I spend my mornings in the garden Daniel built by hand. A soft rebellion against time. Tulips on the edge, lavender in the back, rosemary along the fence. Each bloom feels like a word he never got to say. I water them gently, speaking out loud sometimes even though no one responds. The house no longer feels empty. It feels spacious. Like a place where healing is allowed to echo through the hallways. I've filled the rooms not with things but with peace. The kind that comes after you stop begging for someone to see you and start seeing yourself again. Then one morning as the kettle simmered on the stove, I heard the soft thud of the mailbox. I didn't rush. I let it wait a while. When I finally opened the box, a single envelope sat there. Cream-colored. Addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in years, but would know anywhere. Michael. I didn't open it right away. I simply stood there, the envelope in my hand, the morning breeze tugging at the hem of my robe. The paper was warm from the sun. I could feel the indentations from the pen, proof that he had written it by hand. That he had sat with his thoughts, shaped them into words, and let them spill onto a page meant for no one but me. Was it an apology? A confession? A memory? I didn't know yet. I didn't need to. I walked slowly back toward the house, envelope still in hand. The door creaked softly as I stepped inside. The garden behind me swayed, indifferent to the drama of human hearts. I placed the letter on the table beside the window. The same table where I had once written my own. And I stood there for a long time, the silence folding itself around me like a shawl. There is a power in not knowing. In letting life unfold without forcing the ending. For so long I wanted answers. I wanted justice. I wanted him to say the right thing at the right time in the right way. But now I understand, growth isn't a performance. It's a quiet decision made when no one is watching. That envelope, sitting unopened, was proof of something far more valuable than the words inside. It meant he had paused. That maybe, just maybe, he had looked inward. And even if he hadn't, even if the letter held something less than I hoped for, the gesture itself was enough for now. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is step back and trust that the people you raised will one day meet the values you carried in their own time. I turned toward the stove, poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the chair by the window. The light filtered through the curtains in golden threads. Outside, the wind carried the scent of lavender and rosemary. The letter remained where it was. Unopened. Unrushed. A reminder that love doesn't always arrive on schedule. That sometimes, it takes missing someone to remember who they are. And sometimes, it takes silence for someone to hear the truth of their own heart. As I watched the steam rise from my mug, I allowed a small smile to form. Not because everything had been fixed, but because something had shifted. And that was enough.